The lawyer's voice on the phone sounded almost apologetic when he told me I'd inherited 400 acres of prime Montana land from a great uncle I'd only met twice in my life. And my first thought was whether I could sell it fast enough to pay off my student loans. My name is Nathan Baxter, and 3 weeks ago I was managing a struggling coffee shop in Seattle, pulling double shifts and wondering if I'd ever get ahead. Now, I was standing in a dusty law office in Billings, Montana, staring at a property survey that made absolutely no sense whatsoever. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" I asked the attorney, a weathered man in his 60s named Gerald Morrison who looked like he'd rather be fishing. "Your great-uncle Edmund owned this land outright since 1987, Gerald said, tapping the survey map with a pen that had seen better days. 400 acres, give or take, beautiful property too. Problem is, back in the early 90s he apparently leased portions of it to developers. 3 separate communities got built on your land." I blinked at him. 3 communities. Like houses, whole neighborhoods, Gerald confirmed. Pinewood Estates, Meadowbrook Village, and Sunset Ridge. Each one's got between 60 and 80 homes, and here's where it gets interesting. Each community formed a homeowners association, collected dues, maintained their own roads and common areas. They've been operating under 99-year leases. My brain was struggling to process this. Leases that they've been paying. Gerald's expression turned grim. That's the thing. They were supposed to be paying annual lease fees, significant ones too. Your great-uncle structured it so each HOA owed him $50,000 per year, adjusted for inflation. Should be about $78,000 each by now. He pulled out another document. According to my records, none of them have paid in over 15 years. I sat down heavily in the cracked leather chair. Wait, so they owe me back payments, potentially over $3 million combined, Gerald said, plus ongoing fees. Your great-uncle was apparently a bit of a recluse in his later years. Stopped collecting, stopped enforcing the leases. The HOAs probably figured he'd forgotten or didn't care, but the leases are ironclad. I drafted them myself back in '92. I drove out to see the property that same afternoon, my head spinning with numbers I couldn't quite comprehend. The land was beautiful, rolling hills covered in pine trees with mountain views that belonged on postcards. And sure enough, carved into 3 separate parcels, were neighborhoods that looked like they'd been transplanted from suburban anywhere America. Pinewood Estates was the first one I found, a collection of craftsman-style homes with neat lawns and a community center that looked newer than my car. I parked on a public overlook and just stared at it for a while, trying to wrap my head around the fact that all of this was sitting on land I apparently owned. My phone rang. Gerald again. "Nathan, I should warn you. I made some calls this afternoon. Let the HOA boards know about the situation. You're probably going to hear from them soon." Soon turned out to be about 45 minutes later. I was grabbing dinner at a local diner when a woman in her early 50s marched up to my table like she owned the place. She had that specific haircut that I'd learned to associate with trouble, the kind that says, "I'd like to speak to your manager without words." "Nathan Baxter," she demanded. "That's me," I said, fork halfway to my mouth. "I'm Barbara Hendricks, president of the Pinewood Estates HOA board." "We need to talk." I gestured to the empty seat across from me. Barbara sat down with the rigid posture of someone who'd never relaxed a day in her life. She had a leather folder that she slapped onto the table between us. "This situation is completely unacceptable," she began without preamble. "Our community has been established for over 30 years. We've built equity, we've created a wonderful neighborhood, and now some stranger shows up claiming we owe him money." "I'm not claiming anything," I said carefully. "I inherited land. You built on it. There are leases. Leases that your uncle never enforced, Barbara shot back. We haven't heard from him in decades. For all intents and purposes, we considered the matter settled. Settled how? Did you buy the land? Her jaw tightened. No, but adverse possession doesn't apply when there's a written lease, I interrupted, remembering something Gerald had explained. Look, Mrs. Hendricks, I just found out about this myself. I'm not trying to cause problems, but according to the legal documents, your HOA does owe annual fees. $78,000 a year is robbery, she hissed. We already pay HOA dues. We maintain everything ourselves. What exactly would we be paying you for? For the land your houses are sitting on, I said, keeping my voice level even though my heart was pounding. That's how leases work. Barbara stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. You'll be hearing from our lawyer. We are not paying you a single cent. She stormed out, and I noticed half the diner was staring at me. Welcome to small-town Montana, I thought. The next morning, I got calls from the other two HOA presidents within an hour of each other. Meadowbrook Village's president, a man named Richard Stoltz, was more measured than Barbara, but equally firm that they wouldn't be paying. Sunset Ridge's president, a woman named Karen Whitmore, actually laughed when I brought up the lease fees. Honey, I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull, Karen said, her voice dripping with condescension, but we've been here since 1994. We're not going anywhere, and we're certainly not paying some carpetbagger who swoops in thinking he's going to get rich off hard-working families. I'm not a carpetbagger, I said, gripping my phone tighter. And this isn't a scam. There are legal documents. Then I guess we'll see you in court, Karen said sweetly before hanging up. I spent the next week meeting with Gerald and a property rights attorney named Susan Chang who specialized in land lease disputes. Susan was sharp as a tack and didn't sugarcoat anything. You have an open and shut case, she told me in her office, which had a view of the mountains that almost made the stress worthwhile. The leases are valid, they're enforceable, and the payment terms are clear. The HOAs are in breach of contract. We can sue all three of them. Will I win? I asked. Almost certainly, Susan said. But here's what you need to understand. These aren't corporations. These are communities full of homeowners who probably have no idea their HOA was supposed to be making these payments. If you force the issue and win, the HOAs will have to pay you. That means they'll levy special assessments on every homeowner. I pictured families opening their mailboxes to find bills for thousands of dollars. That's not really what I want. Then you need to negotiate, Susan said. Figure out what you actually need from this situation and find a middle ground. Because if you push for the full back payments plus ongoing fees, you're going to make a lot of enemies very quickly. She wasn't wrong. Over the next few days, I started receiving angry calls and emails from homeowners in all three communities. Someone had leaked my phone number, and people were not happy. You're going to ruin us, one man shouted into the phone. My property value will tank if you force this, a woman said tearfully. This is extortion, another claimed. I stopped answering calls from numbers I didn't recognize and started thinking hard about what I actually wanted. The truth was, $3 million in back payments would be life-changing. But I hadn't come to Montana looking to destroy people's lives. I'd inherited a complicated situation that my great-uncle had apparently ignored for years. 2 weeks after Barbara Hendricks confronted me in the diner, I called a meeting with all three HOA boards. Gerald helped me reserve a community center in Billings, neutral territory for everyone. I expected maybe a dozen people. Nearly 200 showed up. The crowd was hostile from the moment I walked in. People booed. Someone threw a wadded-up piece of paper at me. Barbara Hendricks stood in the front row with her arms crossed, looking triumphant, like the turnout proved something. I took the microphone with sweaty palms. "I know you're all angry," I started. "I get it. This came out of nowhere for you just like it did for me, but we need to have an honest conversation about the facts." "The fact is you're a greedy outsider," someone shouted from the back. "Let him talk," another voice called. I was surprised to see it was Richard Stoltz from Meadowbrook Village. I pulled up the lease documents on a projector Susan had set up. "These are the original agreements between your HOAs and my great-uncle. They're legally binding 99-year leases with annual payment terms. For whatever reason, my uncle stopped collecting about 15 years ago, but that doesn't erase the debt or the ongoing obligation." "So you're going to bankrupt all of us?" a woman in the third row asked. She was holding a toddler who was mercifully asleep. "No," I said. "I'm not interested in back payments." That caused a stir. Barbara's expression shifted from triumphant to suspicious in an instant. "What I want is a fair arrangement going forward," I continued. "The lease terms are outdated, and frankly, trying to collect $3 million from communities that weren't budgeting for it would be both cruel and probably impossible. But I do own this land, and that needs to be acknowledged." "What are you proposing?" Richard asked, stepping forward. "Revised leases with the 3 HOAs," I said. "Reduced annual fees, something reasonable that you can budget for without putting undue burden on your residents. In exchange, I waive all back payments and we start fresh." "How reduced?" Karen Whitmore asked sharply. She'd been quiet until now, watching me like a hawk. $20,000 per community per year," I said. "About a third of what you currently owe under the original terms. That works out to roughly $250 to $300 per household annually, depending on community size. Split across 12 months in your HOA dues, it's manageable." The room erupted in conversation. Some people seemed relieved, others still looked angry. Barbara Hendricks pushed her way to the front. "And why should we agree to this?" she demanded. "Why should we pay you anything when we've been here for 30 years without issue?" "Because the alternative is court," Susan Chang said, stepping up beside me. "And in court, Mr. Baxter will win, and you'll owe not only the full lease amounts but also legal fees. The original lease terms will be enforced, which means $78,000 per year per community, plus over $1 million in back payments each. This is a generous offer." "It's still extortion," Barbara insisted. "It's property rights," Susan countered coolly. "Your homes are on his land." That's the reality. The meeting devolved into arguments after that. People clustered in groups, debating. The 3 HOA boards huddled separately. I stood to the side, feeling exhausted and wondering if I should have just sold the whole property to a developer and been done with it. Richard Stoltz approached me after about an hour. "Can we talk privately?" We found an empty side room. Richard was a tall man with gray hair and a kind face that looked like it smiled more often than it frowned. "I'm a retired real estate attorney," he said. "I've looked at the documents your lawyer sent over. You're in the right, legally speaking." "But," I prompted. "But you're also being more than fair," Richard said. "Barbara's angry because she likes being in control and this situation is out of her control. Karen's panicking because Sunset Ridge has some financial issues already, and any additional expense is going to be hard to sell to their residents. My community, Meadowbrook, we can manage this. We've been well run, we have reserves. I can get my board to agree to your terms." 1 out of 3 is a start," I said. "Give me some time to talk to the others," Richard offered. "Sometimes these things need a voice of reason." Over the next several days, Richard apparently worked magic. He called me on a Thursday afternoon sounding pleased. "I've got Meadowbrook's board in agreement. We'll sign the revised lease. I also spent some time with Karen from Sunset Ridge. She's difficult, but I think I've talked her into accepting that this is the best deal she's going to get. What about Barbara? I asked. Richard sighed. Barbara's going to be a problem. She's convinced she can find a legal loophole. She's hired some attorney from Billings who's apparently promising her he can get the whole thing thrown out. Can he? I asked nervously. Not a chance, Richard said, but she's stubborn. And she's gotten some of the more vocal residents in Pinewood riled up. They're talking about fighting this to the bitter end. Even though it'll cost them more, Barbara doesn't care. She sees this as a matter of principle now. The following week, Meadowbrook Village's HOA board came to Gerald's office and signed the revised lease agreement. It was remarkably anticlimactic. Richard and 4 other board members showed up. We reviewed the terms one more time. Everyone signed, and that was it. $20,000 a year from 68 homes. First payment will be made within 30 days, Richard said, shaking my hand. And Nathan, for what it's worth, I think you handled this well. You could have been a lot less accommodating. 2 days later, Karen Whitmore brought the Sunset Ridge board in. She was frosty and barely spoke to me, but she signed the papers. 73 homes at $20,000 per year. Don't think this means we like you, Karen said as she left. Wouldn't dream of it, I replied. That left Pinewood Estates and Barbara Hendricks. Susan filed a lawsuit for breach of contract and to enforce the original lease terms. We gave Barbara 30 days to respond, which was standard. Instead of responding through her attorney, Barbara launched what I can only describe as a campaign. She started a website called Stop the Land Grab that painted me as a villain trying to steal from honest families. She organized protests outside Gerald's law office. She even got a local news station to do a story, though I noticed they carefully included the fact that the leases were legally valid after I sent them documentation. She's imploding her own case, Susan told me over the phone. Her attorney is going to have a hell of a time in court after all this public hostility. Should I respond? I asked. No, Susan said firmly. Let her dig her own hole. We've got the law on our side. Just be patient. Patience was hard when I kept seeing my name dragged through the mud online. Someone created a fake social media account pretending to be me, posting inflammatory things until I had it taken down. Barbara appeared on a local radio show and claimed I was planning to evict everyone and bulldoze the neighborhood, which was complete fiction. The court date was set for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, I made my first trip to actually walk through the property beyond the communities. My great-uncle's old house was still standing, a log cabin-style home that had seen better days but had good bones. It sat on a hill with a view of all 3 neighborhoods spread out below. I spent a weekend cleaning it out, finding boxes of my great-uncle's papers and personal effects. Most of it was junk, but I found photo albums showing the land before anything was built on it. I also found ledgers showing that he'd collected lease payments religiously from 1992 until 2010, and then just stopped. No explanation, just stopped. There was a journal entry from 2009 that caught my eye. Getting too old for these fights, my great-uncle Edmund had written in shaky handwriting. Barbara from Pinewood called again, arguing about the fees, saying they're unfair. Maybe she's right. Maybe I should just let it all go. So that was it. Barbara had worn him down. She'd complained and argued until an old man had decided it wasn't worth the stress anymore. And then she'd apparently decided that meant she didn't have to pay at all. I brought the journal with me to show Susan. This might explain things, but it doesn't change the legal obligation, she said after reading it. Your uncle chose to stop collecting, but the debt didn't disappear. It just accumulated. The lawsuit moved forward. Barbara's attorney, a young guy named Todd something, filed a motion to dismiss based on adverse possession and equitable estoppment. Susan filed a response that basically shredded his arguments. The judge denied the motion to dismiss and set a trial date. That's when things got weird. I started noticing a car following me around Billings. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, but after the third day of seeing the same silver sedan, I was sure. I mentioned it to Susan, who looked concerned. "Are you being threatened?" she asked. "Not directly, but it's creepy." She advised me to document everything and contact the police if I felt unsafe. I took photos of the car and its license plate. When I ran it through a basic online search, it came back registered to a property management company in Pinewood Estates. Then my car got keyed. I came out of a grocery store to find long scratches down both sides. There was no note, no obvious culprit, but the timing felt deliberate. "This is escalating," Gerald said when I told him. "Some people are taking this way too personally." "Should I drop it?" I asked. "Just walk away from Pinewood?" "That's up to you," Gerald said carefully. "But if you do, you're setting a precedent. You're telling them that if they make your life difficult enough, you'll back down. And you've got 2 other communities watching to see what happens." He was right. If I let Barbara bully me into giving up, what message did that send to Meadowbrook and Sunset Ridge, both of which had honored their agreements? The trial was scheduled for a Tuesday in late September. I dressed in the only suit I owned and met Susan at the courthouse in Billings. Barbara showed up with her entire HOA board and at least 30 residents as a show of support. The gallery was packed. Barbara's attorney, Todd, presented his case first. He argued that the extended period of non-collection created an implied agreement that the leases were no longer active. He argued that Pinewood Estates had made improvements to the land that increased its value, which should offset any owed payments. He argued that enforcing the lease now was unconscionable and would create undue hardship. Susan's response was methodical and devastating. She presented the original lease, which had clear terms. She presented the payment history showing my great-uncle had collected for 18 years. She presented case law showing that a temporary pause in collection did not invalidate a contract. She pointed out that hardship didn't erase legal obligations, especially when the hardship was self-created by refusing to pay. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Reeves, listened to everything and then took a recess to review the documents. When she came back an hour later, her ruling was swift. "The lease is valid and enforceable," Judge Reeves said. "The defendant HOA is in breach of contract. However, given the unique circumstances and the length of time that passed without collection, I'm going to structure the remedy carefully." My heart pounded as she continued. "The plaintiff has offered revised terms to all 3 communities, reducing the annual lease fee from the original $78,000 to $20,000. 2 communities have accepted. Pinewood Estates will accept the same terms. Additionally, while the plaintiff is waiving back payments for the other 2 communities, given Pinewood Estates' aggressive refusal to negotiate, I'm ordering them to pay back payments for the past 5 years. That's $390,000, to be paid over 3 years in structured installments. They will also pay the annual $20,000 lease fee going forward, and they will reimburse the plaintiff for legal fees incurred in this action." Barbara gasped audibly. Several of the Pinewood residents in the gallery looked stunned. "This is outrageous," Barbara stood up shouting. "You can't do this to us." "Mrs. Hendricks, sit down or I'll hold you in contempt," Judge Reeves said icily. "You had multiple opportunities to settle this reasonably. You chose litigation. These are the consequences." Todd, Barbara's attorney, tried to argue for a stay or reconsideration, but Judge Reeves wasn't having it. The ruling stood. As we filed out of the courtroom, I heard Barbara on her phone, already planning an appeal. "Let her appeal," Susan said. "She'll lose, and it'll just cost her community more money." The news spread fast. That evening, my phone started ringing with calls from Pinewood Estates residents who were furious, but not at me. They were angry at Barbara for pushing this into court instead of settling when she'd had the chance. One woman, who identified herself as Jennifer from the Pinewood board, called me directly. "We're having an emergency meeting tomorrow night. Most of the board wants Barbara out. This is a disaster." "I'm sorry it came to this," I said honestly. "Don't be sorry," Jennifer said firmly. "You offered us the same deal as everyone else. Barbara's ego made this worse than it needed to be. We should have accepted your terms months ago." The Pinewood Estates HOA held their emergency meeting and voted Barbara out as president. Jennifer took over and called me the next day to discuss implementation of the payment plan. The judge's ruling allowed for 3 years of structured payments on the back portion, which worked out to about $11,000 per year on top of the $20,000 annual lease fee. "It's going to hurt, but we can manage it," Jennifer said. "We're also investigating whether Barbara misrepresented information to the community about the strength of our legal position. Some residents are talking about personal liability for her role in this mess." "That's between you and her," I said. I didn't want to get involved in internal HOA politics. Over the next few weeks, all 3 communities made their first lease payments. $60,000 hit my bank account in a single month, and it felt surreal. This was more money than I'd made in a year managing the coffee shop. I flew back to Seattle to resign in person and pack up my apartment. My boss was understanding, if disappointed. "Montana, huh?" he said. "Can't say I saw that coming." "Me neither," I admitted. I moved into my great-uncle's cabin and spent the fall fixing it up. It needed a new roof, updated plumbing, and about 1,000 other things, but it was solid. The land around it was beautiful, and I started to understand why Edmund had bought it in the first place. I also started meeting with the HOA boards on a quarterly basis. Richard from Meadowbrook suggested it as a way to maintain good relationships and address any concerns before they became problems. It was awkward at first, especially with Karen from Sunset Ridge, who still barely acknowledged me. But over time it became routine. Then in November things took another turn. I got a call from Jennifer at Pinewood Estates and she sounded shaken. "Nathan, we have a problem, a big problem." "What's wrong?" I asked, immediately concerned. "We've been doing an audit of our finances after Barbara was removed. We're finding discrepancies, significant ones. Money that should be in our reserve accounts isn't there. We're talking about over $200,000 missing over the past 7 years. I felt my stomach drop. "Are you saying Barbara stole from the HOA? We don't have proof yet, but it's looking that way. She had sole signing authority on certain accounts. We're bringing in a forensic accountant, and we're probably going to have to involve the police." This was way beyond property disputes and lease agreements. This was embezzlement. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Nothing right now," Jennifer said. "I just wanted to give you a heads up because when this goes public, it's going to be messy. And Barbara's probably going to try to claim she needed the money because of the lease situation, even though this started years before you showed up." The investigation moved quickly once professionals got involved. The forensic accountant found that Barbara had been systematically transferring money from Pinewood Estates reserve accounts into a personal account. She'd been using her position as HOA president to approve expenditures that never happened, then pocketing the money. The total came to just over $230,000. The police arrested Barbara in mid-December at her home. I saw the news report online, showing her being led out in handcuffs while her husband stood on the porch looking devastated. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I remembered her campaign against me, the harassment, the way she'd put her entire community at financial risk rather than admit she was wrong. Barbara's arrest changed the dynamic in all three communities. Suddenly, I wasn't the villain anymore. I was just a guy who'd inherited land and had tried to work out a fair arrangement. Pinewood Estates residents who'd shouted at me during the trial started nodding politely when they saw me at the grocery store. Karen Whitmore from Sunset Ridge even called to apologize. "I got caught up in Barbara's rhetoric," she admitted. "I thought you were trying to take advantage of us. I should have looked at the facts more carefully." "Water under the bridge," I said. Christmas came and went. I spent it alone in the cabin, which should have been depressing but actually felt peaceful. I'd started hiking the property regularly, exploring parts of the 400 acres that weren't developed. There was a creek that ran through the northern section, and a meadow that filled with wildflowers in the spring, according to old photos I'd found. In January, Barbara's case went to court. She pleaded guilty to embezzlement and was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3. She was also ordered to pay restitution, though the judge noted that she'd likely never be able to repay the full amount. Her husband filed for divorce a week later. I heard through the grapevine that their house was going up for sale to help pay the restitution order. Meanwhile, life in the three communities went on. The lease payments became routine. Meadowbrook and Sunset Ridge paid on time every year without issue. Pinewood struggled a bit more with the additional back payment amount, but Jennifer kept everything organized and transparent. She sent quarterly updates to all residents showing exactly where their money was going. In February, something unexpected happened. Richard from Meadowbrook Village called me with a proposal. "Some of us have been talking," he said. "You own all this beautiful land surrounding our communities. Have you thought about what you want to do with it long term?" "Not really," I admitted. "I've been taking it one day at a time." "What if we proposed a partnership?" Richard asked. "The 3 HOAs work together to develop some of the unused land as shared community spaces. Hiking trails, a park, maybe a community garden. We'd fund it, maintain it, and in exchange, you could offer reduced lease rates or extend the lease terms." It was an interesting idea. "Let me think about it," I said. I spent the next week hiking the property, really looking at it with fresh eyes. There were sections that would make beautiful parks. The creek could have a walking trail along it. The meadow would be perfect for community events. I called a meeting with all 3 HOA boards together, the first time I'd done that. We met at the cabin, and I served coffee and pastries I'd picked up in town. It felt oddly normal, like a neighborhood association meeting instead of a landlord-tenant negotiation. "I like Richard's idea," I told them, "but I want to propose something bigger. What if we created an umbrella organization? A land trust, maybe, that I transfer some of the undeveloped acreage to. Each HOA has representation, we develop it together, and it becomes shared community space that benefits everyone." Karen was skeptical. "What's in it for you? Peace of mind," I said honestly. "And a legacy that's worth more than just collecting checks." "My great-uncle bought this land because he loved it. Then he spent years fighting with people over money. I don't want that to be my story." Jennifer from Pinewood spoke up. "After everything our community has been through, I think we'd be open to that. We need some positive direction." We spent the next several months working with attorneys to structure what we called the Montana Highlands Community Trust. I donated 150 acres of the undeveloped land to the trust. The 3 HOAs contributed initial funding for improvements. We hired a landscape architect to design trails and park spaces. By summer, construction began on the first phase, a 3-mile loop trail connecting all 3 communities. Volunteers from each neighborhood showed up on weekends to help with the work. It was remarkable seeing people from Pinewood, Meadowbrook, and Sunset Ridge working side by side. People who a year ago had been shouting at me in a community center. I kept the remaining 250 acres and the cabin for myself. The lease payments continued to come in, $60,000 a year total, which was more than enough to live on comfortably. I'd gone from struggling to make rent in Seattle to owning a cabin in Montana with a steady income. It still felt surreal sometimes. In August, we had a grand opening for the first completed section of trail. Nearly 400 people showed up, families from all 3 communities plus folks from Billings who'd heard about the project. There were food trucks and live music. Kids ran around with their faces painted. It felt like a real community event. Richard found me near the trailhead watching people explore. "You did good," he said. "You could have been a nightmare landlord. Instead, you became a neighbor." "I just tried to be fair," I said. "Fair would have been enforcing the original lease terms and collecting millions in back payments," Richard pointed out. "You went beyond fair. That matters." Karen walked up, overhearing the conversation. She'd softened considerably over the year, smiling more and scowling less. "I owe you an apology," she said to me. "A real one, not just a phone call. I called you terrible things. I thought the worst of you. I was wrong." "You were protecting your community," I said. "I get it." "Still," Karen insisted. "I should have listened before I judged. I'm sorry." Jennifer joined us, completing the set of all 3 HOA presidents. "We should do a toast or something," she said. "Official commemorating of the trail opening." We found some plastic cups and sparkling cider from one of the food trucks. The 4 of us stood in a circle, and Richard raised his cup. "To second chances," he said. "To communities that can overcome their own mistakes, and to Nathan for being patient with all of us." "To Nathan," the women echoed. We drank, and I felt something settle in my chest. This was home now. Not just the land or the cabin, but this place with these people. It wasn't what I'd expected when I got that phone call from the attorney 9 months ago. It was better. The rest of the summer passed peacefully. I took up woodworking in my spare time, building furniture for the cabin. I started dating a woman named Claire who ran a bakery in Billings. Life developed a rhythm that felt sustainable and good. The HOA payments continued like clockwork. Pinewood finished their 3-year back payment obligation in September, and Jennifer called to thank me for the structured approach that had made it manageable. The communities thrived. Property values in all 3 neighborhoods actually increased, partly because of the new trail system and partly because of the stability that came with resolved legal issues. In October, I got a call from an unexpected source. Todd, Barbara's former attorney, wanted to meet with me. I agreed, curious what he could possibly want. We met at a coffee shop in Billings. Todd looked different than he had in court, less cocky and more human. "I wanted to apologize," he said without preamble. "I gave Barbara terrible advice. I told her she could win when I should have told her to settle. I let my own ego drive the case instead of looking at what was really best for my client." "That must be hard to admit," I said. "I'm not practicing law anymore," Todd said. "After what happened with Barbara's embezzlement coming out and the way I'd pushed the case, I lost most of my clients. I'm working as a paralegal now, trying to rebuild, but I wanted you to know I understand I was wrong." "I appreciate you saying that," I said, and I meant it. It took courage to face someone you'd wronged and own it. "How are you doing?" Todd asked. "I mean, really. This whole thing was a mess." "Honestly, I'm good," I said. "It was rough for a while, but it worked out. I've got a home I love, a community that's mostly accepted me, and a situation that feels sustainable. I can't complain." Todd nodded slowly. "Barbara used to say you were the enemy, but you weren't, were you? You were just a guy who inherited a complicated situation and tried to handle it fairly." "That's all I ever was," I confirmed. We talked for another hour, and by the end, I felt like I'd gained some understanding of the forces that had been arrayed against me. Fear, mostly. Fear of change, fear of losing control, fear of admitting mistakes. Barbara had been driven by all of that, and it had destroyed her life. Todd had been driven by ambition and had nearly destroyed his career. I drove back to the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of orange and pink. The three neighborhoods sprawled below, lights beginning to twinkle as families settled in for the evening. Somewhere down there, people were making dinner, helping kids with homework, watching television. Normal life, happening on land I owned, but that felt increasingly like it belonged to all of us. My phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "Dinner tomorrow. I'm testing a new bread recipe and need a victim." "Only if I get to be a willing victim," I texted back. She sent a smiley face, and I felt that warmth again, the sense of being rooted somewhere. November brought the first real snow, blanketing everything in white. The trail got used by cross-country skiers and snowshoers. The three HOAs organized a joint holiday party in December, held at the Meadowbrook Community Center. I went, not as the landlord but as a neighbor, and spent the evening talking with people about everything except leases and property rights. A man named Tom from Pinewood approached me near the end of the night. "I was one of the people who threw things at you during that first meeting," he admitted, looking embarrassed. "I was angry and I believed everything Barbara told us. I wanted to apologize face to face." "Thank you," I said. "I know it was a scary time for everyone." "My wife and we've lived here 20 years, Tom said. "We've got equity in our home, we raised our kids here. The thought of losing any of that or having some huge bill we couldn't pay, it was terrifying. But you didn't do what we were afraid you'd do. You were reasonable. That meant something." By the end of the night, I'd received versions of that same sentiment from at least a dozen people. The anger had faded, replaced by understanding and, in some cases, genuine gratitude that things had worked out. As I drove home through the snow, I thought about my great-uncle Edmund and his journal entry about being too old for fights. I understood now what he'd meant. It wasn't about the money for him, just like it ultimately wasn't about the money for me. It was about finding a way to live on this land with these people, in a way that didn't make everyone miserable. Edmund had given up, stopped collecting because it was easier than fighting. I'd taken a different approach. I'd insisted on the basic fairness of the lease agreements while being flexible enough to make them work for everyone. It was harder in the short term, but better in the long run. January marked 1 year since I'd inherited the property. Gerald called to congratulate me. "You've handled this better than most people would have," he said. "I've seen situations like this destroy communities and leave everyone worse off. You found a middle path." "I had good help," I said. "You, Susan, Richard, Jennifer, even Karen eventually. People wanted this to work mostly." "Except Barbara," Gerald noted. "Yeah, except Barbara," I agreed. Barbara was serving her sentence at the Montana Women's Prison in Billings. I'd heard she was teaching other inmates basic accounting, which felt ironic given what she'd done. Her house had sold and the money went toward restitution, though it barely made a dent in what she owed. Part of me felt bad for her. She'd had a decent life, a position of respect in her community, and she'd thrown it away through pride and greed. But I also knew she'd made her own choices. I'd given her multiple chances to settle reasonably, and she'd refused every one. The spring brought new flowers to the meadow, and the community trust started phase 2 of the trail development. This section would include a small amphitheater for outdoor events and a playground for the neighborhood kids. The 3 HOAs contributed funding, and I matched it dollar for dollar from the lease payments. Claire and I got more serious. She met my sister who flew out from Chicago, and they got along well, which felt important. We talked about the future in vague terms, neither of us wanting to jinx anything but both feeling like this could be long-term. In May, I got an interesting phone call from a reporter at the Billings Gazette. She'd heard about the situation with the 3 HOAs and wanted to do a feature story. I was hesitant at first, but Susan advised me that good publicity might be valuable if any future issues came up. The reporter, a woman named Angela Smith, spent a day interviewing me and the HOA presidents. The article came out 2 weeks later under the headline, From Land Dispute to Community Partnership: How One Inheritance Brought 3 Neighborhoods Together. It was fair and balanced, covering the initial conflict, but focusing more on how everyone had worked together to resolve it. The article even mentioned Barbara's embezzlement, not as gossip, but as context for why trust and transparency in community governance mattered. The story got picked up by a few other outlets, including a national property rights blog. I got emails from people around the country dealing with similar inherited land situations, asking for advice. I tried to respond thoughtfully, though I made clear I wasn't a lawyer or expert. "You're becoming a minor celebrity," Claire teased when she saw the article. "A very minor one," I said, "in a very specific niche." Summer came around again, and with it the second annual Trail Festival, even bigger than the first year with over 600 people attending. We'd become a destination, people from Billings and surrounding towns coming out to use the trails and enjoy the mountain views. The 3 communities hummed along smoothly. The lease payments continued, regular as clockwork. I'd invested some of the money, saving for the future while using the rest to maintain the cabin and property. I hired a part-time property manager to handle the day-to-day administration, which freed me up to focus on the land trust and my own projects. In August, Jennifer called with news. "We're dedicating the new playground next week," she said, "and the board voted. We want to name it Edmund's Play Area after your great-uncle, if that's okay with you." I felt unexpectedly emotional. "He would have liked that," I managed to say. The dedication ceremony was small but meaningful. A plaque explained that Edmund had owned and loved this land, and that his vision had made the communities possible. It didn't mention the lease disputes or the years of non-payment, just the good parts, the legacy worth remembering. Standing there watching kids play on the new equipment, I realized I'd finally made peace with this entire situation. It had started as an unwanted complication, something that had disrupted my life and forced me into an unfamiliar role. Now it was simply my life, and I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The 3 communities continued to evolve. Sunset Ridge finally resolved some of their financial issues and launched a major renovation of their community center. Meadowbrook Village started a scholarship fund for local high school students, funded partly by excess reserves. Pinewood Estates slowly recovered from the Barbara situation, building back trust and financial stability. And I settled into being Nathan Baxter, guy who lives in a cabin on 400 acres in Montana, collecting lease payments from 3 HOAs and working with them to build something bigger than any of us had planned. Claire moved into the cabin with me in September after we'd been dating for a year. She kept her bakery in Billings and made the commute, which wasn't bad. We talked about maybe opening a second location closer to the communities, something small that could serve the neighborhoods. The holidays came around again, and this time I helped organize the joint community party. It was at Sunset Ridge's newly renovated center, and Karen gave a speech thanking everyone for their patience during the renovation. She made a point of thanking me specifically, which still felt weird but nice. 2 years ago, we were enemies, Karen said publicly. Today, we're partners and friends. That's worth celebrating. People applauded, and I felt Claire squeeze my hand. This was family now in a strange, extended way. Not blood family, but chosen family built through shared challenges and shared space. As the second year ended and the third began, life took on a peaceful predictability. The lease payments continued funding my life, and the improvements to the community trust land. The neighborhoods thrived. Relationships deepened. The initial hostility and fear faded into history, stories people told about how it used to be before everything got worked out. I ran into Tom from Pinewood at a grocery store in March. He was with his wife, and they both greeted me warmly. "We're thinking about downsizing soon," Tom said. "The kids are grown and the house is more than we need, but we're staying in Pinewood. We love it here." "That's good to hear," I said sincerely. "A lot of that is because of how things turned out," Tom's wife added. "When all that stuff was happening with Barbara and the lawsuit, we almost left. We thought the whole neighborhood would collapse, but you worked with us. That made the difference." I thought about that conversation for days afterward. The ripple effects of decisions made 2 years ago, the alternate timeline where I'd pushed for maximum enforcement and made enemies I'd never overcome. That version of events would have been legally justifiable but humanly disastrous. In April, Gerald called with unexpected news. "I'm retiring," he said. "Moving to Arizona with my wife. But I wanted to tell you that your case, the HOA situation, it was one of the most satisfying of my career." "Because we won?" I asked. "Because everyone won," Gerald corrected. "That's rare in legal disputes. Usually someone loses badly. But you found a way where everyone came out ahead. The communities got security and reduced fees. You got income and a home. Even Barbara's situation, as tragic as it was, helped Pinewood clean up their governance. Everybody learned something." After I hung up, I sat on the cabin's porch looking out at the 3 neighborhoods. Smoke rose from chimneys. Cars pulled in and out of driveways. A group of kids rode bikes on the trail. Normal, everyday life, happening on land that had caused so much conflict and now represented stability. Claire joined me on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "How weird life is," I said. 2 years ago, I was managing a coffee shop and could barely pay rent. Now I'm a landlord collecting $78,000 a year from 3 HOAs, living in a cabin in Montana and helping develop community trails. "Having regrets?" Claire asked. "Not even a little," I said honestly. She smiled and leaned against my shoulder. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the mountains change colors as the sun moved across the sky. The 3rd year of lease payments completed without incident. The trust finished Phase 3 of the trail development, adding a small event space and better parking. Usage increased every month. We were getting visitors from as far as Missoula, people who'd heard about the trail system and wanted to check it out. Richard approached me with an idea in June. "What would you think about writing a book?" he asked. "About this whole experience. How to handle inherited land disputes, how to negotiate with communities, how to build partnerships instead of just collecting rent." "I'm not a writer," I protested. "But you have a story worth telling," Richard said. And there are probably thousands of people dealing with similar situations who could use the guidance. I thought about it and eventually decided to at least try. I started writing in the evenings, documenting everything that had happened from that first phone call from Gerald through the present day. It was harder than I expected, reliving some of the stressful moments and trying to articulate what I'd learned. Claire read drafts and offered feedback. "You're too modest," she said after reading one chapter. "You're acting like everything just worked out by accident, but you made specific choices that led to good outcomes. Own that." I revised, trying to be more direct about the decisions I'd made and why. The book grew slowly, a project that might take years to finish if it ever got finished at all. But the process itself was valuable, helping me understand my own journey better. Summer brought the third annual trail festival, now an established tradition. Over 1,000 people showed up. We had to coordinate parking with nearby businesses and bring in extra portable toilets. It was a logistical challenge, but the 3 HOAs worked together seamlessly to pull it off. During the festival, I walked the trails and listened to people's conversations. Families talking about making this an annual tradition. Couples holding hands on the scenic overlooks. Friends laughing over picnic lunches. None of them knew the history, the lawsuits and anger and fear that had preceded this peaceful moment. They just knew it was beautiful and welcoming. That evening, after the crowds had gone home, the 3 HOA boards and I gathered for a quiet dinner at the cabin. It had become our own tradition, a post-festival debrief where we talked about what worked and what could be improved for next year. But this year, Jennifer had something else to discuss. "The Pinewood board took a vote," she said. "We want to name the main trail loop after you, the Baxter Trail, to honor everything you've done for all 3 communities." I was genuinely surprised. "That's not necessary," I said. "Maybe not," Karen agreed. "But it's deserved. You changed the trajectory for all of us. When you could have been ruthless, you were fair. When you could have been distant, you became a partner. That deserves recognition." Richard nodded agreement. "Besides, in 50 years when people are hiking these trails, they should know the name of the guy who made it possible." I looked at their faces, these 3 people who'd started as adversaries or at best reluctant business partners and had become genuine friends. "I'd be honored," I said. The trail naming ceremony happened in September. Simple wooden signs went up at major junctions. "Baxter Trail." My sister flew out for it, and my parents drove up from Colorado, where they'd retired. It was the first time my family had really seen what my life in Montana looked like. "You did good, kid," my dad said, using his favorite phrase from when I was young. "You took a mess and made something meaningful out of it." My mother was more emotional. "Your great-uncle would be proud," she said. "He loved this land, but he didn't know how to share it. You figured that out." As the 3rd year rolled into the 4th, everything stabilized into a comfortable routine. The lease payments were automatic, deposited on schedule. The community trust operated smoothly with a small but dedicated board of volunteers from all 3 neighborhoods. The trails required maintenance, but nothing major. Property values in all 3 communities had increased by an average of 15% over the baseline from when I'd inherited, partly due to the amenities, and partly due to the stable land situation. I married Claire in October in a small ceremony at the meadow on the property. All 3 HOA boards came, along with Gerald, who flew back from Arizona for the occasion. Richard officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for our wedding. It was perfect, simple and surrounded by the land and community that had become home. Barbara was released on parole after serving 3 years of her sentence. I heard she'd moved to Idaho to live with her sister, starting over somewhere no one knew her story. I felt a strange mix of relief that she was out and hope that she'd learned something from the whole experience. But I also knew her choices had consequences that would follow her forever. Jennifer sent me a card when Barbara's release became public. "Thank you for handling everything the way you did," she wrote. "If you'd been different, more vindictive, I think Barbara would have had nowhere to go when she got out. By being fair throughout, you made it possible for her to eventually move on." I hadn't thought of it that way, but maybe Jennifer was right. Fairness wasn't just about the present moment. It was about leaving doors open for people to change and grow, even people who'd wronged you. The fourth year brought new challenges, but manageable ones. A particularly harsh winter damaged some of the trail infrastructure, requiring repairs. Sunset Ridge had a dispute with a contractor that needed mediation. Pinewood discovered a problem with their water system that required expensive fixes. But these were normal community issues, not existential threats. Claire and I settled into married life in the cabin. We expanded it a bit, adding a proper office where I could work on the book and handle property management tasks. She opened a satellite bakery location near Meadowbrook, a small shop that did solid business from the neighborhood residents. Life felt full and purposeful. In the 5th year after inheriting, I received a call from a university professor who taught property law. She wanted to write a case study about the situation for her students, examining the legal issues and how they'd been resolved. I agreed, thinking it might be useful for future lawyers to see an example of dispute resolution that prioritized relationships alongside legal rights. The case study was published in a law journal, and I received a copy in the mail. Reading it felt strange, seeing my life reduced to facts and legal analysis. But the conclusion was gratifying. The professor wrote that the case demonstrated how flexible problem-solving and good-faith negotiation could produce outcomes superior to rigid enforcement of legal rights, even when such enforcement was justified. As I sat in my office reading that conclusion, I heard voices outside. Looking out the window, I saw a family hiking past on the trail, a mom and dad with 2 young kids. The kids were running ahead, excited about something they'd seen, probably a deer or a particularly cool rock. The parents followed at a leisurely pace, holding hands and talking quietly. That family had no idea about leases or HOAs or lawsuits. They just knew this was a beautiful place to spend a Saturday afternoon. And that, ultimately, was the whole point. The legal stuff, the negotiations, the conflicts and resolutions, all of it was in service of creating and maintaining a place where people could just live their lives. I thought about the journey from that first phone call from Gerald, when I'd been a broke coffee shop manager suddenly inheriting 400 acres and a massive headache. I'd stumbled through it, making decisions based on instinct and advice from people who knew better than I did. Some choices had been smart, some had been lucky. But somehow it had all worked out. The lease payments continued year after year, providing steady income that allowed me to live comfortably while investing in the property and community. The 3 HOAs functioned well, with new board members cycling in as others retired or moved away. The original antagonism faded into folklore, stories told to new residents about the early days when everything had been uncertain. Claire and I talked about starting a family, maybe adopting or trying for kids of our own. The cabin and land felt like a good place to raise children, with built-in community and wide open spaces. We weren't in a hurry, but the possibility made the future feel expansive and hopeful. Richard retired from the Meadowbrook board after 6 years, his term limits finally catching up with him. He'd been instrumental in everything working out, and I made sure to thank him properly at his last board meeting. "You were the voice of reason when everyone else was panicking," I told him. I don't think any of this would have worked without you. You would have figured it out, Richard said kindly. But I'm glad I could help. This has been a good chapter of my life, being part of something that actually worked the way it was supposed to. Karen lasted another year before stepping down from Sunset Ridge's board, ready to focus on her grandchildren who'd started visiting more regularly. Jennifer stayed on at Pinewood through a second term, helping the community fully recover from the Barbara years and establish new traditions of transparency and accountability. New leaders emerged in all three communities, people who'd moved in after the disputes were resolved and only knew the stable, cooperative version of the relationship. They brought fresh ideas and energy, and I found myself learning from them as much as they ever learned from me. The book finally got finished in year 6. A small press that specialized in property rights and land management agreed to publish it. How to Inherit Land Without Losing Your Mind. One man's journey from lawsuit to community partnership came out in paperback and ebook. It didn't become a bestseller, but it found its audience. I got emails from people in similar situations thanking me for the guidance. One email particularly stuck with me. A woman in Vermont had inherited a farm that had 3 tenant farmers working parcels under old agreements. The farmers were refusing to pay rent, claiming adverse possession. She'd read my book and decided to negotiate rather than immediately sue. Her email came 6 months after she'd reached out, letting me know they'd worked out a deal that kept everyone farming and gave her a modest income. "Your story showed me there was another way," she wrote. "That made the whole difficult process of writing worth it." As the years continued to pass, I realized that inheriting the 400 acres had been the best thing that ever happened to me, even though it hadn't felt that way at the time. It had forced me to grow up fast, to learn about property law and community relations and conflict resolution. It had brought me to Montana and to Claire. It had given me a purpose beyond just earning a paycheck. The 3 HOA communities thrived on my land, and rather than being a source of conflict, they became a source of meaning. Every lease payment represented families living their lives, kids growing up, memories being made. I wasn't just collecting rent. I was part of something larger, a steward of land and community rather than just an owner. Standing on my porch now, 7 years after that first phone call from Gerald, I watched the sun set over the mountains and the neighborhoods below. Lights twinkled in windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. People were home, safe and settled in a place they loved. And I'd played a part in making that possible, not by being generous or self-sacrificing, but by being fair and flexible when fairness and flexibility were needed most. Claire came out to join me, wrapping a blanket around both our shoulders against the evening chill. "Good day," she asked. "Good life," I replied, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. The inherited 400 acres, the 3 HOA communities paying lease fees, the trails and partnerships and hard-won relationships, all of it had become the foundation of a life I'd never planned but couldn't imagine giving up. It wasn't perfect, and there were still occasional challenges. But it was real and meaningful and mine, and that was more than enough.